On a sunny afternoon in Riverside Park, 14-year-old Darius Bennett was doing something completely ordinary, reading a book. But in just 7 minutes, his peaceful moment would turn into a nightmare that would shake an entire city. What transformed a simple afternoon into a confrontation with police? How did a woman's prejudice nearly destroy a young boy's life? And what happened when she discovered the boy's mother wasn't just any parent, but the city's mayor? This isn't just another story about racism in America. This is about how one brave teenager, his unstoppable mother, and yes, even his accuser, would come together to transform a moment of hate into a movement of hope. Stay with us to witness how this shocking confrontation leads to a complete overhaul of police training, forces an entire community to face its prejudices, and brings two unlikely people face to face in a remarkable journey of redemption. This is Reading While Black, the story that changed Riverside. What would you do if your peaceful afternoon turned into a fight for justice? The wail of sirens grew louder, shattering the stillness of the park. Darius sat frozen on the bench, his book trembling in his hands. He could feel the eyes of the growing crowd on him, curious, judgmental, and indifferent all at once. His heart pounded as two police cruisers screeched to a halt near the fountain. Officer Reed, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped out first, his expression stern. Sergeant Daniels followed closely behind, his older, weathered face showing no emotion. Darius swallowed hard as they approached. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Reed barked. Darius stood slowly, lifting his hands, his voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just waiting for my mom." Margaret stepped forward, her finger pointing directly at him. "That's him," she exclaimed. "He's been sitting here, watching people for over an hour. I think he's scouting the area." The accusation felt like a punch to the gut. Darius could barely process her words. "Scouting?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I was reading a book." Margaret scoffed. "Reading a book? Don't try to play innocent. People like you always have a story." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Darius clenched his fists, fighting back tears. He wanted to scream, to defend himself, but the sharp gaze of the officers pinned him in place. "Do you have ID?" Officer Reed asked, his tone curt. "No, sir," Darius replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm only 14. Sergeant Daniels raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His silence was almost as loud as Reed's demands. Margaret seized the moment, her voice growing louder. "See? He doesn't even have proof he belongs here." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, phones raised to record the unfolding drama. Darius felt exposed, as if the world had turned against him. He glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but no one did. "I told you, my mom is coming to pick me up," Darius said, his voice trembling with frustration. "She's on her way." Before Officer Reed could respond, the sound of a car pulling up nearby drew everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV glided to a stop, its polished surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. The rear door opened, and a woman stepped out, exuding authority with every stride. Gas rippled through the crowd. "Isn't that the mayor?" someone whispered. Monica Bennett, the mayor of the city and Darius' mother, strode toward the scene. Her tailored suit and calm, commanding presence silenced the murmurs instantly. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the flashing lights, the officers, and Margaret's tense posture. "Mom," Darius said, his voice cracking with relief. His hands were still raised, his body trembling from the weight of the accusations against him. Monica's gaze softened briefly as she looked at her son. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder before turning her piercing focus to the officers. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. Officer Reed hesitated, glancing at Sergeant Daniels. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," Reed explained. "We were just investigating." Monica's expression hardened. Investigating a child? Sitting on a bench? Reading a book? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air. "Is that what passes for suspicious these days?" Margaret's face paled as Monica's gaze shifted to her. "And you," Monica said coldly. "What gave you the right to assume my son was up to no good?" Margaret stammered, unable to meet Monica's eyes. I didn't mean, I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Monica interrupted. Her tone was calm, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. And now you're going to explain yourself. The park fell silent as the tension thickened. All eyes were on Monica, the officers, and Margaret. Darius stood silently by his mother's side, the weight on his chest finally beginning to lift. Monica Bennett's gaze cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Standing tall and composed, she radiated authority. The crowd, now frozen in rapt attention, held their breath as she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Let me make this clear," Monica said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "My son was sitting on a bench, reading a book and waiting for me. Explain to me how that warranted a police response." Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner for support. "Ma'am, we were just responding to a report." "A report from whom?" Monica interrupted, turning her sharp gaze toward Margaret. "Was it you?" Her tone was direct, her question rhetorical. Margaret flinched, her bravado visibly cracking. "I didn't mean for things to escalate like this," Margaret stammered. "I just thought he didn't seem like he belonged." "Didn't seem like he belonged?" Monica repeated, her voice growing colder. "And what exactly gave you that impression? His clothes, his skin color, or just your own prejudices?" Margaret looked down, her face flushed with shame. "I was just trying to look out for the community," she mumbled, avoiding Monica's piercing gaze. "Looking out for the community," Monica said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "By accusing a 14-year-old boy of wrongdoing without any evidence? Do you realize the danger you put him in with that call? Or did you even think about that?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond but faltered, the weight of Monica's words silencing her. Monica turned back to the officers, her expression unyielding. "And you," she said, her voice now directed at Officer Reed. "When you arrived, did you question the validity of the call? Did you take even a moment to assess the situation? Or did you jump straight to treating my son like a suspect?" Reed's jaw tightened. "We were following procedure," he said defensively. "We had to act quickly based on the information provided." "Procedure," Monica repeated, her tone biting. "Does your procedure include intimidating children? Demanding ID from a minor who has done nothing wrong? Or is this just how you respond to black boys in public spaces?" Reed's face reddened, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Sergeant Daniels, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Mayor Bennett, I understand your concerns," he said, his tone measured. "And I'll admit this could have been handled better." "Handled better?" Monica said, her voice rising slightly. "This shouldn't have happened at all. My son should never have had to endure this humiliation." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their unease palpable. Monica turned to them, her expression softening as she addressed the onlookers. "This isn't just about my son," she said. "This is about every child, every person in our community who has ever been judged unfairly. This isn't just an individual failure. It's a systemic one." The crowd nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of guilt, anger, and agreement. Monica looked back at the officers, her determination unwavering. "I'm going to make this simple," she said. "I want every officer in this department to undergo mandatory anti-bias training, effective immediately." Sergeant Daniels nodded solemnly. "I'll ensure it happens," he said. "And that's not all," Monica continued. "I'll be working with community leaders in schools to implement programs that address these issues at every level. We need to rebuild trust and foster understanding, because incidents like this can never happen again." Margaret, still standing a few feet away, cleared her throat hesitantly. I want to help," she said quietly. The crowd turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Monica raised an eyebrow. "Help?" she said, her tone skeptical. Margaret nodded. "I realize now how wrong I was. I want to make amends, to learn, and to do better. Please let me be part of the solution." Monica studied her for a long moment, the tension in the air thick. Finally she spoke, her voice measured. "Words are easy," she said. "Action is what matters. If you're serious, you'll commit to attending the anti-bias training and contributing to the programs we're building." "I will," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. "I promise." Monica nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." As the tension in the park began to ease, Monica turned to Darius, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? She asked gently. Darius nodded hesitantly, his voice soft. I am now. Let's go home, Monica said, guiding him toward the SUV. As they walked away, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind them. For the first time that day, Darius felt a small sense of relief. The worst was over, but the fight for change was just beginning. Back at home, the quiet of the evening contrasts sharply with the chaos of the park earlier. Darius sits at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched plate of food. His thoughts swirl, fragmented images of Margaret's accusations, and Officer Reed's commands flashing through his mind. The weight of the day presses on his chest, heavy and unrelenting. Monica moves about the kitchen, her movements brisk but precise. She places a hand on the back of Darius's chair as she passes, a quiet gesture of reassurance. You've barely touched your dinner, she says gently. I'm not hungry, Darius replies, his voice low. He looks up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Mom, why does this keep happening? Why do people see me as a threat just because of how I look? Monica sighs, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. Her expression is a careful balance of compassion and determination. Because the world still has a lot of work to do, she says. People carry biases, sometimes without even realizing it, and those biases shape their actions. But that doesn't make it right. Darius frowns, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. It feels like no matter what I do, someone's going to assume the worst about me. That's why we have to keep fighting, Monica says, leaning forward. What happened today wasn't just about you, Darius. It's about a system that allows these kinds of assumptions to go unchecked. But that system doesn't change on its own. It changes because people like us stand up and demand better. Darius hesitates, his voice quieter now. I wanted to run, he admits, his eyes avoiding hers. When Margaret called the police, I thought about just running away. Monica's face softens, and she reaches across the table to take his hand. And that's exactly why what happened was so dangerous, she says. You were put in an impossible situation. No child should ever have to feel like running is their only option. Darius nods, his throat tightening as he tries to hold back tears. It's just embarrassing. Everyone was staring at me like I'd done something wrong. Monica squeezes his hand gently. You did nothing wrong, she says firmly, and don't you ever let anyone make you feel like you did. What happened today wasn't your fault. It was theirs. For a moment, the room is silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Monica finally breaks the silence, her tone softer now. Do you know what I saw at that park today? Darius looks at her, his expression curious but wary. What? I saw a boy who stood his ground, Monica says, even when it wasn't fair, even when it was terrifying. You kept your head high and you didn't let them break you. That's strength, Darius. Darius shakes his head. It didn't feel like strength. Monica smiles faintly. That's because real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's in the way you stayed calm, the way you told the truth even when they didn't want to hear it. That kind of strength matters. The tension in Darius' shoulders eases slightly, though the weight of the day still lingers. Do you think Margaret meant it? He asked suddenly. When she said she was sorry? Monica leans back in her chair, considering his question carefully. Maybe, she says, or maybe she's just starting to realize how much harm she caused. People don't change overnight, Darius, but moments like this can make them reflect. Whether or not she meant it, she'll have to live with what she did, and hopefully she'll learn from it. Darius nods slowly, her words sinking in. And the officers? He asks. Do you think they'll change? They'll have to, Monica replies, her voice firm again. Tomorrow I'm meeting with the chief of police and the city council. We're going to push for anti-bias training and accountability measures. This isn't just going to be another incident that gets swept under the rug. Darius looks at her, his eyes filled with admiration and a hint of hope. You really think it'll work? Monica smiles, her expression filled with quiet determination. It's a start, she says, and sometimes that's all you need to spark real change. The heaviness in the room begins to lift, replaced by a sense of resolve. Darius leans back in his chair, his mind quieter now. As Monica clears the table, she places a hand on his shoulder. Get some rest, she says. Tomorrow's a new day, and we've got work to do. The next morning, the house is quiet. Sunlight streams through the kitchen window, casting soft patterns on the table where Darius sits. He stares at his phone, scrolling through news headlines about the incident at Riverside Park. Photos and videos taken by bystanders have gone viral, sparking heated discussions online. Monica enters the kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. She notices Darius's furrowed brow and takes a seat across from him. "Still thinking about yesterday?" she asks gently. Darius looks up, his expression conflicted. "It's everywhere," he says, holding up his phone. "People are arguing about what happened. Some are saying I should have just stayed quiet and done what they said." Monica sets her mug down, her gaze steady. "And what do you think?" Darius hesitates, his voice quieter. "I think, I shouldn't have had to prove I wasn't doing anything wrong. I think it's not fair." Monica nods, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. It's not fair. And it's not your job to make people see your worth. But sometimes when the world tries to silence you, standing tall is the most powerful thing you can do." Darius leans back in his chair, letting her words sink in. "But it feels like no one really cares," he says. "Like nothing's going to change." Monica reaches across the table, placing her hand over his. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she says. "But every big movement starts with one moment, one voice. Yesterday you became that voice, Darius. And whether you see it or not, you've already made a difference." Darius looks down at their hands, a small flicker of hope breaking through the doubt. "You really think so?" he asks. "I know so," Monica replies. "Because what happened yesterday isn't staying in the park. People are talking about it, questioning it, and that's the first step towards something better." There's a pause as they both sit quietly, the only sound the faint chirping of birds outside. Monica takes a sip of her coffee before speaking again. "I'm meeting with the city council today," she says. "We're going to push for mandatory anti-bias training for the police force, and I want to expand it to schools and businesses too." Darius raises an eyebrow. "Do you think they'll listen?" Monica smiles faintly. "They'll have to. I'm not giving them a choice." Darius chuckles softly, the sound easing some of the tension in the room. "You're scary when you get like this," he says, a hint of admiration in his tone. Monica laughs, the warmth of her smile reaching her eyes. "Good. That's how you get things done." The lightness of the moment fades slightly as Darius grows serious again. "What about Margaret?" he asks. "She said she was sorry, but what if she didn't mean it?" Monica's expression softens. "That's not something we can control," she says. "But what we can do is hold her accountable. She's attending the anti-bias training, and I've suggested she volunteer at the youth center. Whether or not she fully changes is up to her, but she's taken the first step." Darius nods, his gaze distant as he processes her words. "I guess that's something," he says quietly. "It's more than something," Monica replies. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all you need to begin building something better." Later that afternoon, as Monica heads to her meeting, Darius stays behind, deciding to write down his thoughts in a notebook. The words don't come easily at first, but as he writes, he feels the weight on his chest begin to lift. He doesn't know if anyone will ever read what he's writing, but for now it's enough to get the words out. When Monica returns home that evening, she finds Darius in the living room, his notebook resting on the arm of the couch. "How was the meeting?" he asks, sitting up. Monica's smile is tired but triumphant. "It went well," she says. "The training program is officially moving forward, and the council agreed to additional community initiatives to address systemic issues." Darius smiles faintly. "You're really doing it, huh?" "We're doing it," Monica corrects him. "You're just as much a part of this as I am." Darius leans back, the flicker of hope from earlier growing stronger. "Maybe things can change," he says softly. "They will," Monica replies, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Because we're going to make sure of it." Monica arrives at City Hall early the next morning, her steps purposeful as she prepares for the council meeting. The atmosphere inside the conference room is tense but focused. Community leaders, city council members, and police officials sit around a long table, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Monica stands at the head, her confidence unshaken. "Thank you all for being here," Monica begins, her voice clear and steady. Yesterday's incident at Riverside Park was a glaring reminder of the biases that persist in our community. It wasn't an isolated event. It was a reflection of systemic issues we've allowed to go unaddressed for far too long. She pauses, letting her words settle. My 14-year-old son, Darius, was treated like a criminal for sitting on a bench and reading a book. He was accused, questioned, and humiliated, not because of his actions, but because of assumptions made about him. This is unacceptable. The room is silent, the weight of her words palpable. Monica continues, her gaze moving around the table. This isn't just about Darius. It's about every individual who has faced prejudice, who has been judged unfairly, and who has been made to feel like they don't belong. And it's about the responsibility we all share to create a safer, fairer community. The chief of police, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, clears his throat. Mayor Bennett, I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what happened to your son. It never should have escalated to that point. But implementing changes, especially programs like anti-bias training, takes time and resources. Time and resources are excuses we can't afford anymore, Monica replies, her tone sharp but controlled. Every day we delay is another day someone else could face what my son did. Or worse. Change starts now, and I won't accept anything less. Sergeant Daniels, seated near the end of the table, speaks up. Mayor Bennett is right, he says, his voice steady. What happened yesterday wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. If we don't address it now, we'll be back here again, facing something even worse. Monica nods in acknowledgement. Thank you, Sergeant Daniels. What I'm proposing isn't just about preventing incidents like this. It's about rebuilding trust. I'm calling for mandatory anti-bias training for all law enforcement officers, effective immediately. But it doesn't stop there. Schools, businesses, and community organizations need to be involved too. This is about changing the culture of our entire community. The room murmurs in agreement, and Monica presses on. This training isn't a box to check. It's an ongoing process designed to educate, challenge, and transform the way we think and act. And it's not just about law enforcement. It's about creating a foundation of empathy and understanding for everyone. The chief nods slowly, his expression thoughtful. You have my support, he says. I'll ensure the department prioritizes this initiative. Monica's expression softens slightly, though her determination remains clear. Good, because this is just the beginning. I'll also be working with local schools to introduce programs on empathy and inclusion. We need to reach kids early so they grow up understanding the value of respect and fairness. The council members exchange nods, their skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. What about funding? One member asks. How do we make this sustainable? We'll reallocate resources as needed, Monica replies without hesitation, and I'll personally oversee the implementation to ensure we see real results. The meeting concludes with a sense of momentum, and Monica leaves the room feeling both exhausted and invigorated. Outside, she finds Darius waiting in the hallway, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looks up as she approaches, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. How'd it go? He asks. Monica smiles faintly, her exhaustion showing but her resolve intact. It went well, she says. The training program is moving forward, and the council is on board with expanding it to schools and businesses. Darius nods, his shoulders relaxing slightly. So it's really happening? It's really happening, Monica confirms. This isn't just about fixing one incident. It's about creating lasting change. That evening, Monica and Darius sit on the porch, the golden glow of the setting sun washing over them. The air is quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. Do you think it'll work? Darius asks softly. The programs, the training, all of it? Monica leans back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. It's not going to fix everything overnight, she says, but it's a start. And sometimes a start is all you need to begin making a difference. Darius looks out at the horizon, his mind quieter than it's been in days. I guess you're right, he says after a pause. It's better than nothing. It's better than nothing, Monica agrees. And it's better than staying silent. For the first time since the incident, Darius feels a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of a better future. At the youth center near Riverside Park, Margaret Lewis sits at a small table surrounded by children working on art projects. Her usually composed demeanor is softer now, her sharp edges replaced by a quiet humility. She passes out colored pencils and paper, offering gentle encouragement to the kids as they work. One of the younger boys holds up his drawing for her to see. "Do you like it?" he asks, his voice eager. Margaret smiles genuinely, her heart warming in a way she hasn't felt in a long time. "It's beautiful," she says, her tone sincere. "You've got real talent." The boy beams and returns to his work, leaving Margaret with a sense of cautious hope. Volunteering at the youth center was Monica's suggestion, one she initially resisted. But now Margaret is beginning to understand the importance of these connections and the healing they bring. As she tidies up the art supplies, Margaret looks up to see Darius entering the center. He stops in his tracks when he notices her, his expression unreadable. Margaret feels a pang of nervousness, but takes a deep breath and approaches him. "Hi, Darius," she says softly, her voice steady despite her nerves. Darius studies her, his gaze guarded but curious. "Hi, Mrs. Lewis," he replies, his tone polite but distant. Margaret hesitates, searching for the right words. "I didn't know you'd be here," she begins. "But I'm glad. I've been wanting to talk to you." Darius raises an eyebrow but doesn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I know I've apologized before," Margaret says, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But I need you to understand how truly sorry I am. What I did to you was wrong. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and hurtful, and I'll never stop regretting it." Darius remains silent, his expression thoughtful but reserved. "What made you change your mind?" he asks after a moment. Margaret exhales slowly. "The anti-bias training opened my eyes," she says. "It made me realize how much fear and prejudice I was carrying, things I didn't even know were there. But more than that, I saw the harm those biases caused, not just to you, but to everyone around me." Darius tilts his head slightly, considering her words. "So what are you doing about it?" he asks. Margaret's voice steadies as she replies. "I'm volunteering here at the youth center. I'm trying to connect with the community I once misunderstood. Your mom also asked me to share my story during the training sessions, to show others the impact of bias and why it's so important to change." Darius nods slowly, his gaze softening slightly. "It's going to take time," he says, "for me and probably for you too." "I know," Margaret replies, "but I'm willing to put in the time. I want to do better." As Darius walks away to join his friends, Margaret feels a mix of relief and determination. It's not forgiveness, not yet, but it's a step forward. And for her, that's enough to keep going. Later that week, Margaret speaks at another anti-bias training session. Standing in front of a room filled with police officers and community members, she recounts her experience at the park, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she speaks. "I judged a boy because of how he looked," she says. "I made assumptions that weren't just wrong, they were harmful, and I almost cost him his dignity, or worse, his safety. But I'm here because I want to change. I want to do better, and I want to help others do better too." The room is silent as her words sink in. Margaret steps down from the podium, her heart pounding, but for the first time, she feels like she's making a real difference. The next time she sees Darius at the youth center, their exchange is less tense. "Hi, Mrs. Lewis," Darius says as he walks past, offering her a small but genuine smile. "Hi, Darius," Margaret replies, her heart lifting at the simple gesture. It's not a friendship, but it's progress. A quiet understanding that things can change, one step at a time. Weeks later, the ripple effects of Monica's anti-bias initiative begin to reshape the community. Police officers attend training sessions, confronting their own biases and learning to build trust with the residents they serve. Schools introduce programs on empathy and inclusion, teaching children the value of understanding and fairness from an early age. Darius finds himself at the center of this change. One afternoon, he's invited to speak at a school assembly about his experience. Standing on stage in front of his peers, his hands tremble slightly, but his voice is steady. "I was just sitting in the park reading a book," he begins, "but that day I learned how much assumptions can hurt. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I was made to feel like I didn't belong." The auditorium is silent as his words sink in. "I didn't want to speak up at first," Darius continues. I was scared, but my mom showed me that staying silent doesn't help anyone. If we don't talk about these things, nothing will ever change. When he finishes, the room erupts into applause. Darius feels a mix of pride and relief, realizing that his voice does matter, that his story has the power to inspire others. At Riverside Park, the bench where the incident took place has become a quiet symbol of resilience and growth. Darius visits the park often, no longer feeling the weight of judgmental stares or whispers. Instead, he is met with nods and smiles from familiar faces. One sunny afternoon, Margaret approaches him cautiously. Her usual stiffness has softened over the weeks, replaced by a quiet humility. "Hi, Darius," she says, her voice gentle. "Hi, Mrs. Lewis," Darius replies, his tone neutral but polite. Margaret hesitates before sitting down a few feet away. "I just wanted to thank you," she says, "for giving me a chance to learn and grow. I know I don't deserve it, but it means more to me than you know." Darius studies her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's good you're trying," he says finally, "but it's going to take time for people to trust that you've changed." "I know," Margaret replies, her voice steady, "and I'll keep working at it." They sit in silence for a moment, watching the children play nearby. Margaret smiles faintly. "The kids at the youth center, they've taught me a lot," she says, "about kindness, about seeing people for who they really are. I wish I'd learned those lessons sooner." Darius nods but doesn't respond. He stands up after a while, offering Margaret a small, genuine smile before walking away. It's not forgiveness, but it's a step forward, and both of them feel its weight. That evening, Darius and Monica sit on their porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The air is warm, and the faint sounds of the city hum in the background. "Do you think everything we've done is actually making a difference?" Darius asks, his voice thoughtful. Monica leans back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think it already is," she says, "but change takes time. It's not just about the programs or the policies. It's about people, like Margaret, like you, choosing to do better every single day." Darius nods slowly, his face reflecting quiet determination. "I guess you're right. It feels different now." "It is different," Monica replies, "and it'll keep getting better as long as we keep pushing for it." For the first time since the incident, Darius feels a deep sense of hope. The ache in his chest has eased, replaced by the quiet confidence that progress, while slow, is possible. As the sun dips below the horizon, he resolves to continue being part of that change, one step at a time. Darius' story isn't just about one afternoon in a park. It's a reflection of the challenges many face every day. It's a reminder of how assumptions and biases can cause harm and how the courage to speak out can create meaningful change. What began as an act of injustice became a turning point for an entire community. Monica's determination to address systemic issues turned a painful moment into an opportunity for growth. The anti-bias training program wasn't just about fixing one incident. It became a foundation for building a safer, more inclusive community. Margaret's transformation showed that even the deepest biases can be challenged when people choose to reflect and act. But change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires every one of us to look inward, confront our own assumptions, and hold ourselves accountable. What role will you play in ensuring that everyone feels safe, valued, and respected? Darsh's journey reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right despite it. Now it's your turn. Speak up. Take action. Be the change your community needs. Because progress begins with a single step, and together we can create a world where everyone belongs.